The Iraq War: Strategy, Firepower, and Controversy. Before we begin today's story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. And if you love forgotten history and powerful untold truths, please subscribe, like, and share this video so together we can spread these stories across a wider audience and rewrite the false history we were told. Tonight we travel into one of the darkest and most controversial wars of the modern age. A war filled with fire, betrayal, power, politics, destruction, and secrets that changed the world forever. This is the story of the Iraq War, the strategy, the firepower, and the controversy that left millions shocked and asking one question: was this war truly necessary, or was the world deceived? Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. In the early years of the 21st century, the world was already trembling with fear. The attacks of September 11th had shaken America to its core, and smoke had barely cleared from New York before powerful voices in Washington began whispering of another enemy. Not hidden in caves, not wandering mountains, but seated in palaces. They said his name was Saddam Hussein, the ruler of Iraq, a man already feared across the globe for brutality, military aggression, and iron rule over his people. American leaders stood before cameras and declared that Saddam possessed terrible weapons, weapons of mass destruction, weapons so dangerous they claimed he could strike nations far beyond his borders. They said Iraq was building chemical weapons, biological weapons, and perhaps even nuclear weapons. They warned the world that if action was not taken now, disaster could come later. Fear spread like wildfire. Some believed the warnings immediately. Others doubted the claims. But as the months passed, the drums of war grew louder. President George Bush stood before the American people and promised action. Diplomats argued at the United Nations. Protesters filled streets around the world. Some cried that the invasion would save the world from terror. Others shouted it would unleash hell on earth. But by early 2003, the decision had already been made. War was coming. Thousands of troops gathered in Kuwait. Massive tanks rolled through desert sands. Fighter jets lined airfields. Aircraft carriers crowded the Persian Gulf. One of the most powerful military machines in history was preparing to strike. Yet few truly understood what was about to happen. Behind the scenes, America's leaders had developed a bold strategy. They called it shock and awe. The plan was simple but terrifying. Strike Iraq with such overwhelming force, such speed, and such destruction that the Iraqi government would collapse before it could even react. They believed they could destroy Saddam's will to fight in days. They believed Iraq's army would crumble instantly. They believed the people would celebrate American troops as liberators. But history would soon prove war never follows the plans of men. On the night of March 20th, 2003, the skies over Baghdad exploded with fire. Missiles screamed through darkness. Bombs shook the earth. Buildings trembled. Windows shattered. The night sky turned orange as flames rose into the heavens. American and British aircraft launched wave after wave of attacks, striking government compounds, communication centers, bunkers, military bases, and suspected hideouts. Television cameras captured the horror live for the world to see. The bombardment was unlike anything many had ever witnessed. It was a storm of steel and flame. Iraq's capital shook under the force of modern warfare. Then came the ground invasion. Coalition troops crossed from Kuwait into Iraq, racing northward at astonishing speed. American Marines stormed through desert roads. British troops secured southern cities. Special forces operated secretly in the north. Massive Abrams tanks crushed Iraqi defenses with terrifying ease. Helicopters swept across battlefields like hunters in the sky. Iraqi soldiers who had once marched proudly now found themselves facing an enemy with unmatched technology, unmatched speed, and unmatched firepower. Entire Iraqi divisions collapsed in panic. Many fled. Some surrendered without firing a shot. Others fought and were destroyed. Saddam Hussein had believed Baghdad could become a fortress. He expected his elite Republican Guard to hold back the invaders and bleed them slowly. But his forces were no match for the coalition's advanced weapons. In only weeks, American troops reached the gates of Baghdad. The world watched in disbelief. It seemed impossible. One of the Middle East's strongest armies had nearly collapsed in less than a month. Then came one of the most iconic moments of the war. On April 9th, 2003, American troops entered central Baghdad. Crowds gathered around a giant statue of Saddam Hussein. Marines tied cables around it. The statue was pulled down before cameras broadcasting worldwide. Cheers erupted. Some danced in celebration. To many watching, it appeared the war was already over. Saddam's government had fallen. Baghdad had been captured. Victory seemed complete. President Bush soon stood aboard an aircraft carrier beneath a banner that read, "Mission accomplished," declaring major combat operations had ended. But behind the celebration, something far darker was beginning. For while the Iraqi army had been defeated, Iraq itself had not been conquered. The government collapsed so suddenly that chaos swallowed the nation. Looters stormed government buildings, museums, banks, and military depots. Ancient treasures vanished forever. Streets became lawless. Fires burned across cities. Armed gangs formed overnight. And then came one of the greatest strategic mistakes of the entire war. The coalition made a decision that shocked many military experts. They disbanded the Iraqi army completely. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers, many armed, many angry, many humiliated, were suddenly thrown into the streets with no pay, no purpose, and no future. At the same time, officials banned thousands of former government workers from service simply because they had ties to Saddam's ruling party. Teachers, officers, engineers, administrators, all removed instantly. In one stroke, Iraq's entire state structure collapsed, and from the ruins rose fury. Men who had lost everything now swore revenge. Former soldiers became insurgents. Hidden weapons caches were opened. Secret networks formed in shadows. What America thought was victory was only the beginning, because Iraq was not at peace. Iraq was becoming a trap. At first, attacks were small. A roadside bomb here, a sniper shot there, a patrol ambushed in an alley. But then the violence spread. Bombings became daily. Suicide attackers struck markets and checkpoints. Convoys exploded in fireballs on desert roads. American troops who had expected celebration instead found hatred, resistance, and death waiting in every street. The enemy had changed. There were no clear battle lines, no uniforms, no front lines. The war had transformed into something far more dangerous. A guerrilla war, an insurgency. A nightmare where any civilian could be friend or foe. Any parked car could explode. Any smiling face could hide murderous intent. The coalition's superior tanks and aircraft suddenly mattered less in narrow streets and crowded neighborhoods. America had won the invasion, but now it faced an enemy it could barely see. And the deeper troops pushed into Iraq, the more another terrible truth emerged. The weapons of mass destruction they had promised the world were nowhere to be found. Search teams combed through bunkers, warehouses, laboratories, and hidden compounds. Nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Still nothing. Doubt began growing. Had the intelligence been wrong, or had the war been built on lies? Around the world, critics erupted in anger. Protesters demanded answers. Governments distanced themselves. Trust began collapsing. Yet for soldiers on the ground, politics meant little. Their reality was survival. Every patrol became life or death. Every knock at a door could trigger gunfire. Every mission could be the last. The war everyone thought would end quickly was spiraling into something far bloodier than anyone expected. And soon Iraq would descend into even greater darkness as sectarian violence, terror groups, betrayals, prison scandals, and one of the deadliest insurgencies in modern history would tear the country apart. The invasion had only opened the gates. The real nightmare was just beginning. The fire beneath the ashes. As the smoke of Baghdad's fall drifted into the sky, and foreign leaders declared triumph before the cameras, a different reality was growing beneath the surface, one far more dangerous than any battlefield the coalition had prepared for. Iraq had not surrendered in spirit, only in form, and the collapse of Saddam Hussein's government had left behind not peace, but a vacuum so vast and chaotic that darkness rushed in from every side. In the weeks after the invasion, American soldiers moved through ruined streets, believing they were maintaining order. But every passing day revealed the truth that Iraq was becoming more unstable, not less. The old police force had vanished, the army had been dissolved, ministries stood empty, and with no functioning authority left to govern the country, lawlessness spread like wildfire through every province. Men looted government depots, criminals raided neighborhoods, and black market weapons flooded the streets until rifles, grenades, and explosives could be found in nearly every corner of the country. What had once been hidden inside military bunkers was now in the hands of civilians, gangs, and men hungry for revenge. In villages and cities across Iraq, whispers turned into meetings, meetings turned into cells, and cells turned into armed resistance. Former soldiers who had once served Saddam Hussein, humiliated by defeat and enraged by dismissal, began organizing in secret. Radical preachers stood before crowds and denounced the occupation as an invasion of Muslim land. Foreign fighters slipped across borders from neighboring nations, eager to wage holy war against American troops. And soon what began as scattered attacks turned into a relentless campaign of bloodshed that shocked the world. The first weapon of the insurgency was fear. It arrived not through tanks or missiles, but through hidden bombs buried beneath roads, concealed in dead animals, tucked beneath trash piles, and wired inside parked vehicles. These improvised explosive devices, known simply as IEDs, became the most feared weapon in Iraq. A soldier could survive machine gun fire, dodge bullets, and escape ambushes, only to lose his life when a hidden bomb detonated beneath his convoy in an instant. Roads that once seemed harmless became corridors of death. American Humvees rolled cautiously through narrow streets, every soldier's eyes scanning rooftops, windows, gutters, and doorways, knowing that death could strike from any direction without warning. Then came the ambushes. Insurgents learned quickly. They studied American patrol pattern, attacked when troops were most vulnerable, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. Snipers perched on rooftops and in minarets, waiting patiently for the perfect shot. Mortars rained onto bases in the middle of the night. Suicide bombers drove trucks packed with explosives into checkpoints, police stations, and crowded public squares. Baghdad became a city where explosions echoed daily, where smoke rose from every district, and where no one felt safe after sunset. American commanders realized with growing horror that the war they had planned for no longer existed. Their tanks and jets could crush armies, but this enemy wore no uniform, carried no flag, and melted into crowds the moment battle began. Every civilian might be harmless, or might be carrying a bomb beneath his clothes. Every child waving on the roadside might be signaling insurgents nearby. The battlefield had become invisible. Meanwhile, sectarian tensions that had long simmered under Saddam's rule began boiling over. Iraq was home to deep divisions between Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, Kurds, and other ethnic and religious groups. divisions Saddam had held together through brutal force. Once he was gone, that forced unity shattered. Militias formed across the nation, each claiming to defend its people while secretly preparing for dominance. Neighborhoods that had once housed mixed communities now turned suspicious, then hostile, then murderous. Revenge killings spread. Mosques were bombed. Families fled their homes in terror. Entire districts became battlegrounds where rival groups hunted one another in the night. It was no longer just an insurgency against the coalition. Iraq was tearing itself apart from within. One of the most feared insurgent leaders to emerge during this chaos was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a ruthless extremist whose brutality shocked even fellow militants. Zarqawi formed what would become al-Qaeda in Iraq, a group dedicated not just to fighting Americans, but to plunging Iraq into total sectarian war. His fighters kidnapped civilians, beheaded hostages on camera, bombed holy sites, and slaughtered worshippers simply to inflame hatred between Sunnis and Shiites. His strategy was devilishly simple. If Iraq burned in enough chaos, the occupation would fail, and extremist forces would rise from the ashes. And for a time, his plan worked. By 2004 and 2005, Iraq was descending into near civil war. But even as violence worsened outside, another scandal was exploding inside coalition ranks, one that would damage America's reputation around the world. In early 2004, horrifying photographs emerged from Abu Ghraib prison. The images showed Iraqi prisoners stripped naked, humiliated, beaten, stacked in piles, threatened by dogs, and abused by American guards. The world reacted with fury. The same coalition that claimed to be bringing freedom and justice now stood accused of cruelty and torture. Across the Middle East, the scandal fueled rage and became a recruitment tool for insurgents who pointed to the photos as proof that the occupation was not liberation, but humiliation. Trust shattered further. Every attempt to win hearts and minds became harder. Every patrol became more dangerous. The insurgency fed on outrage. Yet despite all this, America still possessed overwhelming military firepower. Whenever insurgents gathered in force, the coalition answered with devastating precision. Fighter jets screamed overhead, dropping laser-guided bombs onto enemy positions. Attack helicopters hovered over battlefields, raining rockets into buildings and alleyways. Abrams tanks rolled into contested cities with thunderous force, crushing barricades and firing shells that reduced entire rooms to rubble. In cities like Fallujah, coalition troops launched massive offensives to retake insurgent strongholds house by house, street by street, often in brutal urban combat. The Battle of Fallujah in 2004 became one of the fiercest battles of the war. Marines fought through booby-trapped homes, sniper fire, tunnels, and barricaded streets in a savage campaign that left much of the city destroyed. Entire blocks became ruins. The battle demonstrated America's raw military strength, but also showed the terrible cost of urban warfare. Every victory seemed to create new resentment, new destruction, and new recruits for the insurgency. By 2006, Iraq stood on the edge of total collapse. Sectarian killings had become daily horror. Bodies appeared in streets each morning with signs of torture. Death squads roamed neighborhoods at night. Entire families disappeared. Baghdad itself was being torn apart by violence. American generals warned that unless something changed quickly, Iraq would descend into full-scale disaster. So the United States made a dramatic move. President Bush announced what became known as the Surge, a major escalation of troop numbers designed to flood Iraq with fresh forces and restore order. More than 170,000 troops would eventually participate in the expanded effort, pushing into Baghdad and violent provinces in a desperate attempt to crush insurgents and stabilize the nation. It was a gamble, one many believed would fail. But combined with new tactics and alliances with local Sunni tribes who turned against al-Qaeda, the surge began producing results. Violence dropped in many areas. Insurgent safe havens were disrupted. Markets reopened. Streets once ruled by militias became calmer. For a moment, it seemed the tide might finally be turning. Yet even as security improved, one haunting question remained. What had all this blood achieved? Thousands of American soldiers were dead. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had perished. Entire cities lay in ruins. The promised weapons of mass destruction had never appeared. The war that was meant to be swift and decisive had become a grinding occupation, soaked in controversy and tragedy. And though the violence had lessened, the wounds of Iraq were far from healed. Beneath the fragile calm, resentment still simmered, political divisions deepened, and extremist ideas continued to spread. The war was not ending. It was merely changing shape. And in the years ahead, the decisions made during this conflict would unleash consequences so severe they would shake not only Iraq, but the entire world. Because from the ashes of this war, a new terror was rising, one even more brutal than what had come before. The war that changed the world. By the time the violence in Iraq began to slow after the surge, the war had already transformed from a military campaign into a wound that scarred the entire world. What had started as a mission to remove a dictator and destroy alleged weapons of mass destruction had become a brutal struggle for survival, credibility, and control. And everywhere people looked, questions haunted the conflict like ghosts. Was the war justified? Had the intelligence been false from the beginning? Had the greatest military power on earth walked into a trap of its own making? As American troops fought to stabilize Iraq's shattered streets, leaders in Washington faced growing outrage both at home and abroad. Investigations were launched. Intelligence agencies were questioned. Reports emerged that the claims of Saddam Hussein possessing active chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons had been deeply flawed, exaggerated, or simply wrong. The stockpiles that had been used to justify invasion were nowhere to be found. No secret nuclear labs, no hidden biological weapons factories, no underground chemical arsenals. Nothing. Around the world, trust in Western leadership began to collapse. Critics accused governments of misleading the public. Some said leaders had manipulated fear to launch a war of choice, not necessity. Others argued that the invasion itself had violated international law, lacking the clear approval of the United Nations Security Council. Massive protests broke out in capitals across the world. In the eyes of millions, the Iraq War had become not a symbol of justice, but a symbol of deception. Yet for the soldiers still fighting and dying in Iraq, debates in distant capitals meant little. Their war continued every day in dust, blood, and fire. Even as violence dropped in some areas, danger remained constant. The enemy adapted endlessly. Insurgents used children as lookouts. Women carried messages between cells. Militants disguised themselves as police officers. Suicide bombers targeted funerals, weddings, schools, and mosques. The brutality of the conflict hardened everyone caught within it. American troops, exhausted by endless deployments and invisible enemies, grew increasingly tense and suspicious. Iraqi civilians, trapped between occupation forces, insurgents, and sectarian militias, often trusted no one. Every checkpoint was tense. Every misunderstanding risked tragedy. And in this environment of fear and suspicion, terrible mistakes happened. Civilian casualties mounted. Airstrikes intended for militants sometimes destroyed homes filled with families. Raids based on faulty intelligence led to innocent people being arrested or killed. Each mistake deepened resentment, and each resentment fed the cycle of violence anew. Meanwhile, Iraq's political future remained uncertain. A new democratic government had been established, elections were held, and new leaders rose to power. But beneath the appearance of progress, the country remained deeply fractured. Corruption infected institutions. Rival parties battled for influence. Sectarian favoritism poisoned trust. Many Sunni communities felt marginalized by the new Shiite-dominated government, believing they had traded one form of oppression for another. In the north, Kurdish regions grew increasingly autonomous, pursuing their own ambitions. Iraq was no longer under Saddam's iron grip, but it was far from united. It was a fragile nation, stitched together by fear, foreign support, and temporary compromise. Then came another major shift. In 2008, American politics turned sharply as public fatigue with the war reached a boiling point. Families had grown weary of funerals. Veterans returned home carrying wounds, both visible and invisible. The cost of the war had soared into trillions of dollars. Support for continued occupation faded rapidly. Leaders began planning an exit. Agreements were negotiated for the gradual withdrawal of American troops. Base after base began closing. Convoys rolled south toward Kuwait. By December of 2011, the final U.S. combat troops officially left Iraq, ending nearly 9 years of direct military occupation. Cameras showed soldiers crossing the border, flags lowered, and speeches declaring the war over. But once again, reality proved more complicated. The departure of American troops did not mean peace had been secured. In truth, Iraq remained unstable, wounded, and vulnerable. Many of the same divisions that had fueled the war were still unresolved. Militias remained armed. Political trust remained weak. Sectarian tensions remained high. And in the prisons, refugee camps, and hidden corners of Iraq and neighboring Syria, extremist movements were quietly reorganizing. Among them were the shattered remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the same brutal network once led by Zarqawi. Though weakened, they had not been destroyed. They had learned from defeat, adapted, and waited patiently. As civil war erupted in neighboring Syria, these militants found fresh opportunity. They crossed borders, seized weapons, recruited fighters, and rebuilt stronger than before. Then they emerged under a new name that would terrify the world, the Islamic State, known as ISIS. In 2014, only a few years after American withdrawal, ISIS launched a stunning offensive across Iraq. Entire Iraqi army divisions collapsed in panic. Major cities fell within days. Mosul, one of Iraq's largest cities, was captured almost overnight. Militants paraded through streets with stolen tanks, American weapons, and black flags waving in triumph. The world watched in horror as ISIS declared a caliphate, executed prisoners en masse, enslaved civilians, and spread terror through medieval brutality. For many observers, the rise of ISIS was the final, bitter proof that the Iraq War's consequences had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. The removal of Saddam Hussein had not simply ended one regime. It had destabilized an entire region, creating the vacuum in which something even worse could grow. At the same time, the war dramatically shifted power across the Middle East. Iran, once restrained by Saddam's hostile regime, now found its influence expanding deeply into Iraq through allied militias and political partners. Tehran's power grew stronger. American rivals celebrated U.S. difficulties. Allies questioned Washington's judgment. Across the globe, the Iraq War reshaped how nations viewed intervention, intelligence, and military power. It became a lesson in how quickly battlefield victory can collapse into political disaster. The aftermath is not understood. Historians, generals, and world leaders would spend years studying the conflict, asking what went wrong, what could have been done differently, and whether the war should have happened at all. But beyond politics and strategy lay the human cost. The cost carried by millions whose lives were forever changed. More than 4,400 American service members lost their lives. Tens of thousands returned wounded, many with lifelong injuries. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died, some in bombings, some in combat, some in sectarian massacres, and many simply caught in the chaos of war. Entire generations of Iraqi children grew up surrounded by gunfire, explosions, and fear. Families were displaced, cities were shattered, ancient communities vanished. Trauma seeped into every corner of society. For those who lived through it, the war was not numbers on paper or debates in parliament. It was burned homes, empty chairs at dinner tables, sleepless nights, and memories too painful to forget. The Iraq War had begun with promises of liberation, security, and swift victory. It had begun with tanks racing through desert sands and bombs lighting the skies above Baghdad. It had begun with declarations that the world would be safer. But now, after years of bloodshed, one truth stood undeniable. Wars are not judged by how they begin, but by what they leave behind. And what Iraq left behind was controversy, instability, grief, and lessons written in blood. Yet even with all its tragedy, the Iraq War remains one of the most studied military conflicts of the modern era. A case study in overwhelming firepower, strategic brilliance on the battlefield, and catastrophic miscalculation in occupation and nation-building. It showed the world the unmatched strengths of modern military technology. It also showed the limits of that strength when faced with insurgency, ideology, and broken political planning. It proved that toppling a government is one thing. Rebuilding a nation is another entirely, and its legacy still echoes today in every debate about foreign intervention, every military academy lesson, and every region touched by the aftershocks of its decisions. The war may have officially ended, but its shadow still stretches across the world, reminding all who study it that sometimes the most dangerous part of war is not the battle itself, but what comes after the guns fall silent. Legacy of fire, power, and pain. Even after the guns grew quieter and official speeches declared missions complete, the Iraq War refused to disappear into history like other conflicts before it. Because this was not merely a war fought on battlefields, it was a war that reshaped nations, shattered alliances, transformed military doctrine, and left behind lessons so painful that the world still debates them many years later. The Iraq War became a warning written in blood, showing how even the strongest armies on Earth can achieve total battlefield dominance and still struggle to secure lasting peace. It became proof that victory in war is not simply defeating an enemy in combat, but understanding what comes after the battle. And in Iraq, what came after the battle was perhaps more dangerous than the invasion itself. Military experts often describe the opening phase of the Iraq War as one of the most successful modern invasions ever executed in terms of speed and tactical dominance. In less than 2 months, coalition forces had destroyed one of the largest armies in the Middle East, toppled a government, seized a capital city, and shattered conventional resistance with astonishing efficiency. The world watched as American and British forces demonstrated what overwhelming technological superiority looked like in real time. Satellites tracked enemy movement from space. Drones monitored roads and compounds from the sky. Fighter jets delivered precision-guided bombs directly through windows. Tanks advanced through enemy positions almost untouched. Communication systems allowed commanders to coordinate operations instantly across massive distances. Night vision equipment turned darkness into daylight for coalition soldiers. Helicopters could strike targets in seconds. No army in the region could match that kind of firepower. Saddam Hussein's forces were simply overwhelmed by a military machine decades ahead in technology and planning. To many watching, it looked like warfare itself had changed forever. It seemed to prove that modern armies using speed, precision, intelligence, and superior coordination could defeat larger traditional armies with ease. But then came the brutal reality that military dominance does not guarantee strategic success. The same army that crushed Iraq's military in weeks found itself trapped for years in a conflict it could not quickly end. The same tanks that dominated open deserts became vulnerable in narrow urban streets. The same aircraft that ruled the skies struggled against enemies hiding among civilians. The same overwhelming force that won the invasion could not stop hidden insurgents from striking and vanishing into crowds. And so Iraq changed the way military strategists think about war forever. It proved that defeating an army and defeating an idea are not the same thing. You can destroy tanks, bases, and governments, but defeating resistance, anger, ideology, and political instability require something much more complicated than weapons. This lesson would influence military planning across the world for decades. The Iraq War also transformed how insurgencies are fought. Before Iraq, many conventional armies still focused heavily on traditional battlefield warfare, large formations, open combat, and armored offensives. But Iraq forced militaries to adapt rapidly to counter insurgency warfare, intelligence-driven operations, urban combat, population protection, and psychological strategy. Troops had to learn that in modern conflicts, sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a missile or a tank, but a hidden explosive beneath a road, a rumor spread through a village, or a single extremist with a camera and internet connection broadcasting propaganda to the world. Information warfare became just as important as bullets. Every civilian casualty, every mistake, every prison abuse scandal became a weapon in itself, used by enemies to fuel anger and recruit more fighters. This war taught nations that perception can shape victory as much as combat can. Yet perhaps the deepest controversy surrounding the Iraq War was not how it was fought, but why it was fought. Even today, one of the most heated debates in modern political history surrounds the question of whether the invasion should have happened at all. The central justification presented to the public was the claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a grave threat to international security. That claim drove speeches, diplomatic efforts, and public support in the early days. But when no such weapons were found, the credibility of governments suffered deeply. Many citizens felt betrayed, trust in institutions weakened. Skepticism toward intelligence agencies and foreign policy leaders increased dramatically. For many people, Iraq became a symbol of the dangers of acting on flawed intelligence, rushed assumptions, or political agendas disguised as necessity. Even among those who believed Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator deserving removal, many argued that the way the war was justified damaged trust for generations. This mistrust would affect future conflicts, making citizens and allies far more cautious whenever leaders argued for military intervention again. Internationally, the Iraq War also strained relationships between allies. Some nations strongly supported the invasion. Others strongly opposed it. Old friendships between governments were tested. Public opinion in many countries turned sharply against the United States and Britain. Large anti-war protests filled cities across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. For a time, the war deeply damaged the image of Western powers in the eyes of millions around the world, especially after scandals like Abu Ghraib revealed abuse and misconduct by occupying forces. The photographs from that prison became one of the darkest symbols of the conflict, showing that even armies claiming moral superiority could commit terrible acts when discipline and oversight failed. These images did immense damage to the coalition's legitimacy and gave propaganda victories to extremist groups across the globe. But beyond military and political consequences, Perhaps the most tragic legacy of the Iraq War lies in its human suffering. Behind every statistic is a life, a family, a future altered forever. American families buried sons and daughters who never returned home. Iraqi parents searched rubble for missing children. Refugees fled neighborhoods they had lived in for generations. Entire communities were uprooted by fear and violence. Doctors worked in hospitals overflowing with wounded civilians. Teachers tried to educate children while explosions shook school walls. A whole generation grew up knowing war not as history but as daily life. Trauma became part of normal existence. Some soldiers returned home carrying invisible wounds, haunted by memories of battle, friends lost, civilians killed, and choices made in impossible situations. Post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and emotional scars followed countless veterans long after the war ended. For Iraqis, the trauma was even broader, touching nearly every family in some way. This suffering reminds the world that war is never just strategy and politics. It is pain lived by ordinary people, whose names history often forgets. The Iraq War also changed the Middle East permanently. Saddam Hussein's fall removed one of the major balances against Iranian influence, allowing Tehran to expand its reach across Iraq and beyond. Regional power dynamics shifted dramatically. Sectarian divisions deepened, not only in Iraq but across neighboring nations. Militant groups gained experience, weapons, and propaganda opportunities. The instability contributed directly to the rise of ISIS, which later terrorized Iraq, Syria, and much of the world. In trying to eliminate one threat, the war helped create conditions for another, even more extreme threat to emerge. This remains one of the harshest ironies of the conflict, that a war launched partly in the name of defeating terrorism ended up fueling new waves of extremism. Yet history rarely deals in simple judgments. Some still argue the war removed a dangerous dictator and gave Iraqis a chance at self-rule. Others argue that whatever good may have come cannot outweigh the suffering and instability unleashed. Both perspectives continued to clash in debates, books, documentaries, and classrooms around the world. What is certain is that the Iraq War will forever remain one of the defining conflicts of the 21st century, studied not only for its battlefield brilliance, but for its painful consequences. It stands as a warning to every future leader that war must be entered with caution, with honesty, and with full understanding of the consequences beyond the first battle. Because invading a nation may take weeks, but rebuilding it can take generations. Destroying a regime may be simple, but creating peace is far harder. The Iraq War proved that modern armies can dominate battlefields with unmatched force, but no amount of firepower alone can heal division, restore trust, or build stable societies from ruins. And so when historians look back on Iraq, they do not see merely a war, they see a lesson in ambition, in power, in pride, in strategy, and in the terrible unpredictability of conflict. They see how one decision changed millions of lives, redrew maps of influence, altered military doctrine, and left scars still visible across the world today. The Iraq War began with shock and awe, with roaring jets, racing tanks, and promises of swift victory. But it ended as something far more complicated, a cautionary tale of how the most powerful nations can win every battle and still lose the peace. And now, as this story comes to an end, one question remains for every viewer watching. When history remembers this war, will it be remembered as liberation, as tragedy, or as both? Only time can answer. And perhaps history itself is still deciding. Thank you for watching Forgotten Chronicles, where we uncover the truths history tried to bury. Before you go, tell us in comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. And if you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this channel so you never miss our deep historical stories.